have been discussing about this new paper entitled as Environmental Ethics, which is being introduced to the 7th semester GE students from the Department of Philosophy in University of Delhi, which is technically the 4th year. And in this paper, which has been floated in DU for the very first time under the NEP-UGCF syllabus, this paper, Environmental Ethics, seeks to explore and explain and elucidate the nuances connected with ecology and feminism and environmental feminism and so on and so forth. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. We have been discussing about what is environmental ethics. We have also picked up the various approaches to ecofeminism, to environmental ethics. We have discussed how ecofeminism has its strengths and weaknesses. Now, going ahead in today's lecture, we would be picking up the article which is Carolyn Marchant's Ecofeminism, and we would also try to connect the same with Vandana Shiva's work on ecofeminism. These readings are a part of the prescribed readings under the paper Environmental Ethics. First thing first, we talk about Carolyn Marchant here. Now, Carolyn Marchant's core claim begins by stating that ecofeminism is not merely an environmental extension of feminism, but an epistemological and ethical reconstruction of how Western civilization has conceptualized nature, gender, and power. She positions ecofeminism as arising from, number one, feminist struggles for equality, number two, environmentalism's recognition of ecological limits, and number three, social justice movements. Carolyn Marchant argues that the dual domination of women and nature is neither accidental nor parallel, but structurally intertwined in Western modernity. Marchant situates ecofeminism as a critique of dualistic metaphysics, of course, René Descartes' mind-body split, Plato's form-matter distinction, and the mind-body dualism. Instrumental rationality, we talk here about the Bacon's, the Baconian science, the Enlightenment, the utilitarianism, and so on and so forth. And of course, the capitalist modes of production, which is the commodification of labor and ecosystem services. Ecofeminism begins or becomes a meta-critique of Western rationality, somewhat similar to Foucault's power knowledge analysis. Irigary's critique of phallocentric metaphysics, or Marx's analysis of alienation, deep ecology's biocentricism, but with more concern for social relations. Carolyn Marchant's opening is conceptually ambitious. However, the claim that gender and environmental oppression are always linked may risk over-universalization. Critics argue that in some cultures, women have high status, yet ecosystems are still degraded. For instance, in some matrilineal societies are affected by modern development, and with massive capitalization, industrialization, nature is at the receiving end, though on paper women are progressing in such matrilineal societies. Marchant later addresses this partially, but the introduction leaves these vulnerability exposed. We find, besides the opening, the historical genealogy, that is from organic cosmos to mechanical world machine, makes a comeback. Now, this is the most historically rich section in Marchant's paper or work, and Marchant uses it to demonstrate that world views are politically charged. The reasons are, number one, the medieval organic world view. Marchant revisits her classic thesis from the death of nature. Medieval Europe viewed nature as a living organism imbued with spirit or animism. The earth was understood as a mother, not as inert matter. Labor relations were embedded in reciprocal ties rather than extractive ones. Women, because of their association with fertility and life cycles, had symbolic alignment with cosmic vitality. Marchant is not idealizing the Middle Ages. She acknowledges gender oppression existed, but she argues the metaphors of the age did not legitimate violent domination of nature in the same way early modern science later did. Number two, the scientific revolution. Carolyn Marchant argues that the 16th and 17th century revolution in science created a paradigm shift, which is the Bacon's or Baconian mechanics, where nature portrayed as a female body whose secrets must be extracted. Scientific discourse used language of penetration, taming, binding, forcing metaphors that resonate with patriarchal domination. Bacon's program for scientific mastery becomes the philosophical justification for extractive capitalism. Now, when we talk about the Cartesian dualism, we see that the mind is masculine, rational, uncorporeal, body or matter is feminine, extended, passive. Animals are automata, nature is mathematically measurable substance. So, dualism becomes the ontological foundation for the subordination of anything coded as feminine: emotion, embodiment, reproduction, and ecosystems. Mechanistic materialism. This new worldview frames nature as inert, which is not self-moving, valueless except as a resource, quantifiable, turning life into numbers external to human purposes. This shift rationalizes mining, plantation agriculture, colonial exploitation, industrial capitalism. Marchant's genealogy is illuminating, but some philosophers challenge the causal weight she assigns to metaphors. They argue that Bacon's metaphors may reflect patriarchal culture rather than producing it. The mechanical worldview also enabled medical and technological progress. Not all strands of early modern science adopted violent metaphors. Nevertheless, Marchant's historical narrative reveals that conceptual frameworks shape ethical possibilities, which remained a foundational insight. Now, in this article, there is also this part where the logic of dualisms or the philosophical architecture of domination is discussed, and we will be delving into this part now. If we look at Marchant's thesis as being displayed in the PPT here, we see that Marchant constructs a table of dualisms which structure Western thinking: the dominant masculine and the subordinate feminine. She says that if the dominant is reason, the subordinate is emotion. Dominant culture, subordinate nature. Dominant is the mind, subordinate is body. Dominant is public, subordinate is private. Dominant is production, subordinate is reproduction. And again, dominant is universal, subordinate is particular. So, her point is clear, which is These binaries are not neutral distinctions but hierarchical oppositions that enable exploitation, and that is where the entire problem lies. The subordination of women parallels the subordination of nature because both are placed in the subordinate column. Then we also see that the table resonates with Plumwood's critique of hegemonic rationality, or Irigary's sexual difference theory, or Simone de Beauvoir's analysis of women as the other. Critical theories' insights on instrumental reason, be it Horkheimer or Adorno and others. Dualisms create an epistemic distancing. By thinking of nature as the other, man justifiably controls it. By thinking of women as the other, patriarchy justifies dominating them. So Marchant's mapping is theoretically powerful, but critics argue that not all cultures have the same metaphysical dualisms. Essentializing women as closer to nature can reinforce stereotypes. Marchant tries to avoid essentialism, but the risk remains. Still, Marchant is not claiming women are naturally closer to nature. She is saying they are made so by symbolic coding. This distinction is sometimes lost in quick readings of ecofeminism. Now, with this part being kind of clear, we move ahead yet to another important part of Marchant's section, which is the ecofeminist ethics and alternative paradigm of care, relationality and responsibility. Now, this section is Marchant's constructive philosophical contribution. Number one, ethics of care. Marchant draws from feminist ethics like Gilligan, Noddings and others, where moral reasoning is contextual and not abstract. Ethics emerges from relationships rather than principles, and caring is a more practice and it is not a sentiment. This sharply contrasts with utilitarian, the Kantian deontology, the Rawlsian proceduralism, all of which assume rational disembodied agents. Number two is the situated ecological knowledge. Inspired by feminist epistemology like Haraway's situated knowledges, Marchant argues that knowledge is embodied. Ecological expertise is distributed locally. Women, especially in subsistence and indigenous societies, possess eco-pragmatic knowledge that modern science often ignores. Partnership ethics, Marchant proposes a model of partnership which includes mutualism instead of hierarchy, reciprocity instead of domination, co-evolution instead of mastery. Now, this echoes Aldo Leopold's thinking like a mountain, but more socially grounded. Deep ecology's identification with nature, but without abandoning social justice. So, the indigenous ethics of many philosophers like Andean Buon Vivre comes here. However, there is also a critical insight to this. Marchant's ethics is holistically appealing, but critics say care is too vague for policy design. Partnership metaphors risk romanticizing harmony. Ecosystems involve predation and completion. Some ecofeminists like Janet Beale argue care ethics may reinforce gender roles. Despite these critiques, Marchant's framework is ethically rich and sensitively attuned to real-world ecological relations. Now, that we have understood more or less about how Carolyn Marchant has been harping about this very important segment of environmental ethics, let us also take a minute here and see some of the critique of mainstream environmental ethics. First, in deep ecology, if we see the strength, we realize that it recognizes intrinsic value of all beings. It advocates biocentric egalitarianism. Weaknesses, however, are that it is too abstract, ignoring power relations. It ignores how patriarchy structures ecological harm. It emphasizes on wilderness over lived environments. So Marchants point out clearly which is deep ecology demands personal transformation but neglects gender, neglects labor, neglects capitalism, and of course colonialism too is neglected in the process. Marchant systematically evaluates the major branches. Social ecology. Here we see that the strengths, it's insightful about hierarchy and domination. It connects ecological and social oppression. Weaknesses, however, is that it is still anthropocentric. It subordinates nature to human self-realization. It underestimates nature's agency. Marchant partially agrees with Bookchin but finds his anthropology limiting. There is also the land ethics of Aldo Leopold's, where the strengths, of course, are that it is holistic, it places humans with ecological communities. Weaknesses, however, is that it is gender blind. Secondly, it is too ecologically general, insufficiently socially specific. Marchant appreciates Leopold's holism but argues that ethical widening must include gender and class justice. Now, about the utilitarian or the deontological ethics, Marchant rejects these for being disembodied, formalistic, blind to structural inequalities, or ill-equipped to address ecological relationality. So, Marchant's critiques are now widely accepted, but some argue she caricatures mainstream ethics as uniformly abstract, ignoring newer developments in environmental pragmatism. Her dismissal of rationalistic ethics may be too sweeping. Still, her intervention remains essential for exposing the socio-political blind spots of classical ethical theories. Now, in this section, we would be picking up Carolyn Marchant's article from the angle of praxis, activism, and the ecofeminist future. Now, Marchant's concluding vision is normative, practical, and political. She talks about restorative praxis. Now, what is that? She says that ecofeminism is not just theory, it is reclamation of degraded lands, grassroots movements led by women, participatory ecological governance. Examples Marchant also emphasizes include the CHIPCO, the Green Belt movement, anti-toxics activism, and so on and so forth. Number 2, democratizing environmental decision-making. Marchant argues that women must be included in ecological planning. Knowledge must be decentralized. Communities must co-create ecological futures. She argues for gender-responsive environmental policies. Cultural transformation. Marchant calls for re-symbolization of nature, cultural narratives that portray nature as partner, not enemy, educational reforms in introducing environmental justice, and feminist lenses. So, Marchant's praxis-oriented proposals are compelling, but they lack institutional specifics. Example, how to restructure global supply chains. Critiques from Marxist ecology argue how focus on culture underplays structural capitalism. Some indigenous scholars say ecofeminism needs deeper dialogue with non-Western cosmologies. So we see that what Marchant achieves, her chapter or her article synthesizes on the history of science, feminist philosophy, environmental ethics, critical theory, political ecology. She offers a deep relational ethical vision grounded in embodiment, reciprocity, and socio-ecological justice. Now, what remains is what the tension is, and that is essentialism versus constructed symbolism, romanticism versus realism, care ethics versus policy clarity, cultural critique versus material analysis. Yet, these tensions do not diminish Marchant's contribution. They define the ongoing challenges for ecofeminist theory. So basically we see that Carolyn Marchant's work, if we are to summarize now, which was published in 2014 entitled as Ecofeminism and Feminist Theory in Michael Boylan's edited work, Environmental Ethics, Marchant is easily one of the most influential voices in ecofeminism. And specifically her chapter is a compact synthesis of her lifelong argument that the domination of women and the domination of nature are structurally interlinked and historically co-produced. The essay moves from historical genealogy to conceptual analysis and critiques of the mainstream environmental ethics and gives proposals for an ecofeminist framework. So we see that Marchant begins by defining ecofeminism as a theoretical and political position that holds women and nature are subordinated in analogous ways. Patriarchal, capitalist and scientific worldviews are historically responsible for these oppressions. Women's agency and ecological healing are mutually reinforcing. She positions ecofeminism not merely as feminism extended to ecology, but as a philosophical reorientation of ethics grounded in experience, embodiment, care, and historical memory. So we see that easily Marchant is essentially making a genealogical claim where modernity's conceptual binaries like human versus nature, male versus female, mind versus body, structure moral blindness. Her approach is critical historical, closer to Foucault in its tracing of power, and Arendt in its concern for worldliness and plurality. However, as we had noted in the critical segment of this chapter, that the introduction sets the tone well but does not yet justify why the linkage between women and nature should be philosophically mandatory rather than historically contingent. Critics often argue, is the women-nature connection essential or merely socio-political? Marchant acknowledges but does not resolve this fully here. And what we see is Marchant's argument where she outlines two phases, the medieval or the organic worldview with nature as living, nurturing, cyclical, women had symbolic and practical association with life purposes, and the scientific revolutions, mechanistic worldview where nature recasts as inert matter, and Bacon and Descartes are the early science who had emphasized mastery, control and extraction, and the language of science incorporated metaphors of penetrating, unveiling and extracting nature's secrets are the debated feminized metaphors. So Marchant's historical narrative is a critique of Cartesian dualism and the Baconian empiricism, showing that the epistemology of modern science is also a politics of domination. Thus, in her reading, we see epistemology is ethics is social order. And this is Marchant's strongest contribution. However, some argue her reading of the scientific revolution is too monolithic, ignoring internal complexity. Example, Descartes also recognized animal emotions. Bacon had ambivalent metaphors. Ecofeminist linkage sometimes risks romanticizing the pre-modern organism. Still, her genealogical insight that modern exploitation of nature is not value neutral is sharp and enduring. So, we do see that she argues that there are not mere conceptual binaries but hierarchies, some of which we had already mentioned, and she is deeply in her methodology. She is structuralist and critical theory. Marchant echoes Plumwood and Haraway's and Irigary's in showing how logic of domination is encoded in metaphysical assumptions. Nonetheless, Marchant rightly exposes how oppressive metaphysics becomes the political economy, and she proposes the normative ethical framework grounded in ethics of care, situated knowledge, non-violent coexistence, participatory democracy. And yes, with this, we see that Marchant's ethics is a blend of Aristotelian phronesis, which is practical wisdom, the feminist ethics of care, the deep ecology, and the communitarianism ethics. And we had also noted that the strength, of course, of Marchant's work is that it is a holistic ethical system integrating politics, spiritually, and ecology. And the weakness is that it sometimes, its normative breadth becomes vagueness, like care, rationality, participation, and all that. Still, Marchant's ecofeminist ethics remains one of the most actionable framework in environmental humanities. Thank you so much. We will be continuing more about Vandana Shiva in our next lecture on ecofeminism. Thank you.